The Hand of the Necromancer by Brad Strickland, Chapter 9. A terrified Johnny pedaled to the professor's house, turned in at the pothole driveway, and jumped off his bike. He leaped up the porch steps two at a time and pounded on the door. "Professor! Professor, you gotta help me!" yelled Johnny, his voice cracking. The professor opened the door, a look of astonishment on his red face. He was in baggy gray cotton trousers, an open-collared blue shirt, and his scruffy old navy blue terry cloth slippers. "What on earth is wrong, John?" he asked, his eyes round with wonder. "Miss Farrington thinks I stole something," stammered Johnny, tears in his eyes. She has the police after me, but I didn't, Professor. I swear to God I didn't." "Calm down," said the professor in a kindly voice. "I can hardly understand what you're saying. Miss Farrington thinks you stole something?" When Johnny nodded miserably, the professor looked angry. "Why, that's preposterous. What are you supposed to have pilfered from that museum, better described as Junk Pile Manor?" "I don't know," confessed Johnny. Do you think she'll send me to jail?" He imagined jail as a dark brick closet with rats and spiders creeping around in the smelly dankness. "Certainly not," exclaimed the professor. "Give me a minute to get into some more suitable clothes, and then let's march over to your house, John Michael. When trouble comes, I always believe you should face right up to it. And don't worry, you have plenty of good friends, and we know you'd never steal so much as a paperclip from the Gudge Museum." The professor made Johnny come inside and sit in the new armchair in the living room, while he went upstairs for his shoes, tie, and jacket. Johnny began to weep, not because he was so frightened, but because he had seen tears glistening in the professor's eyes, too. He knew that what Professor Childermass said was true. Grandma and Grandpa would just about give up their lives for Johnny, and so would the professor and Fergie. The thought of having friends like that overwhelmed Johnny, and he cried, partly out of a reaction to his fear and uncertainty, but mostly out of relief. A more presentably dressed professor came downstairs, nodded grimly, and said, "Let's go." The two of them hurried across Fillmore Street, where the professor summoned Johnny's grandmother and grandfather to what he called a council of war. They sat at the oak table in the kitchen, and a hesitant Johnny did his best to explain what had happened. The professor could not sit still, but paced, humming unmusically, as he often did when angry or worried. When Johnny's explanation trailed off, everyone was quiet. The red electric clock made a buzzing sound that seemed loud in the silence. "I can get to the bottom of this," announced the professor, as he went to make a telephone call. After a few minutes, he returned, rubbing his hands. "Everyone can relax. The police are not after Johnny, despite what he heard Miss Farrington say. They don't believe Johnny was in on the heist." Grandpa raised his eyebrows and scratched his bald head. He frowned and said, "In on the what, Rod?" The professor looked impatient. "The heist, you know, the caper." He read a lot of mystery stories, and he thought that policemen and criminals talked like that. When he saw that Grandpa still didn't have a glimmer of what he meant, the professor puffed out his cheeks, rolled his eyes, and said in an exasperated voice said, "The burglary, to put it in plain English." Grandma, a short white-haired woman, put her hand against her chest. "Mercy's sake, somebody robbed the Gudge Museum? What did they steal, Professor?" "According to the police," the professor said, "the criminal had a strangely discriminating taste. The burglar lifted only items from the Colonial Curiosities room, and at that he took only the ones I had lent to the museum. So the yegg, or as you would probably call him, the thief, got away with a box full of crummy junk that he could probably fence for, maybe $11.17. A shock ran through Johnny. "Professor!" he exclaimed. "That means—" The professor gave him a warning look. "That means that the burglar was dumb enough to think that those stupid old gewgaws were actually worth good American money," he said firmly. "But we know he was mistaken." Johnny realized that the professor did not want him to mention Mr. Murgle in front of Grandma and Grandpa. He swallowed his words and nodded. "Well, Rod," said Grandpa, "why did the woman think Johnny took her old rubbish anyway?" Professor Childermass made a face. "From what the police say, it's because he worked late yesterday and was the last one to leave. Johnny was supposed to lock up the museum before he went home." "I did," said Johnny. "I remember trying to pull the front door open and it was locked tight." "How about the back door?" asked the professor. Johnny frowned. "The loading dock door? Well, that one has to be opened with a key all the time. I mean, if you open it with a key and then close it, it locks automatically." "Are you sure you pushed the door all the way shut?" asked Grandma, looking worried. "Mightn't you have made a mistake, Johnny?" Johnny shook his head. "I know it was locked when I left. That door has a whatchamacallit, a closer on it that pulls it shut. I heard it click. I know I did." "I believe Johnny," said Grandpa, laying a big hand on his grandson's shoulder. Of course you do, returned the professor. So do I. My heavens, if they need a character witness, Father Higgins will be glad to testify to Johnny's honesty. You can't get a much better reference than a priest. Still, even honest people can make mistakes, said Grandma. Be that as it may, returned the professor calmly. Miss Farrington swears that the back door was ajar this morning. It was propped open, and also someone had jammed the lock so it couldn't close properly. I didn't do it, Johnny insisted. The professor patted him on the shoulder. Of course you didn't. Now don't worry. You see, I own all the things that are missing from the museum. Even if you left the front door open with a sign saying, hey, crooks, come in and help yourselves, I would have to file a complaint for the police to bother you, and I have no intention of complaining about losing that miserable heap of trash. My frivolous brother Perry had no right to saddle me with all that ghastly garbage anyway. Good riddance is what I say. But Grandma and Grandpa were still troubled, so the professor said he would take Johnny down to the police station and put the fix in. They walked downtown, and on the way, Professor Childermass warned Johnny, I'm sorry I stepped in so abruptly back there, but our charming Mr. Murgle is no one your grandparents should be worrying about. Let me deal with him, and everything will be all right. Do you think he did it, Professor? Asked Johnny in a small voice. He hated this walk to the police station, and he had a lingering fear that they might throw him in a cell and give him the 3rd degree. Do I think Mr. Murgle stole the Black Leech exhibits? Mused the professor. Well, let me put it this way. A big, fat yes, and I do think our police force will pin... And do I think our police force will pin the crime on him? Not in a million, billion, gazillion years. No doubt our clever felonious friend has set up some cozy little alibi, just as he did after ransacking my house. Probably he will claim to have been in Bombay admiring a white elephant, or in Kathmandu chatting with a llama, or maybe in Marie Birdland hobnobbing with some emperor penguins. What does he want with all that stuff? Asked Johnny. The professor sighed. Lord knows, Dr. Coote has worked hard gathering together all the old manuscript books on the evil wizard, Blackleech, but I haven't read through them yet. I will owe Charlie a delicious dinner at some first-class restaurant when all this is over. He's taking time out from correcting the proofs of his voodoo book to research these things for me. They went into the police station, and in a small room, a young plainclothes officer came in to talk to them. He had sandy brown hair, a long nose, and eyebrows that were so high they made him look a little astonished all the time. He introduced himself as Sergeant Mike Kluzakowski and listened politely to Johnny's story. Then Sergeant Kluzakowski pulled his nose thoughtfully, as if it were not yet quite long enough to suit him. I see. Well, Miss Farrington reported that she came in this morning to unlock and she felt a breeze. She went down the hallway and into that little alcove, and there she found the back door open. It was propped with a brick. She tried to close it. That was a silly thing to do because we want civilians to leave a crime scene alone, and the lock wouldn't click. Someone had jammed a small piece of gravel in the latch plate. She went through the whole museum and discovered that the exhibits in the curiosities room were missing. And then she called us in. He gave Johnny a rueful smile. I don't really think you're to blame, but I'm afraid Miss Farrington is pretty mad. You've probably lost your job. The sergeant turned to the professor. Now, since you own these antiques, I guess it's up to you to give us a description of them. There's really no need for that. I don't want to press charges, the professor told him. The young policeman tugged at his nose once again. Well, that's a little awkward because you see breaking and entering is a crime. In fact, it is a felony, which means we can't drop our investigation, whether you want your stuff back or not, so I'll have to insist that you give us a description of the missing items. Professor Childermass grumbled a bit, but he finally agreed. A black-haired young woman carrying a stenographer's pad came in and took down the information. At last, Sergeant Klukowski